I want to point out, that in every class society that's ever existed, the ruling elements do not rule nakedly. They always adorn their rule with myths or themes and symbols and the like to justify their privileged positions at the apex of the social pyramid. So the 1% spins its self-legitimating myths. As I said, no ruling class rules nakedly. All of them make up, they take strenuous efforts to justify their rule. I tell students when they say, oh, they don't care what we think, they ignore us and all that, I say, oh, no, that's the only thing they care about you. The only thing they care about you is what you're thinking. They don't care if you eat correctly. They don't care how your living conditions are. They don't care that they've built up an inhuman and irrational traffic system that's strangulating us and polluting our air. They don't care about anything. The only thing about you they care about is what you're thinking. In the morning they start, what's going to be the story today? How do we manipulate? How do we control? How do we contain? How do we influence? How do we act upon what it is that they have in their minds? Modern capitalist societies avoid telling the truth about themselves. Instead, we get those rag to riches mythologies, the Horatio Alger stories, myths about fair play, equal opportunity, self-reliance, freedom, liberty, all those kind of things that they feed us again and again. A system that's been so productive and so wonderful and the like. The two fundamental myths of modern corporate capitalism that I want to treat are the myth that capitalism creates a general prosperity and a well-being, material well-being. That's myth number one. Myth number two, that capitalism creates or bolsters democracy. We even hear the phrase capitalist democracies, Western capitalist democracies and the like. Let me start with the one about prosperity. Before I get into that, there's another secondary myth I want to put aside. When I'm talking about capitalism, I'm talking about giant corporate capitalism, okay? I'm not talking about mom and pop small businesses. We're talking about transnational corporations and banks. You know, Lenin himself dealt with that question. He said 10 million small businesses count for nothing. A few giant cartels count for everything. It wasn't that he was dismissing or thinking less of the small. He was talking in terms of power, where the power is, who's shaping the condition of our lives, who determines the quality of the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, the kind of jobs we can have, the images we have to deal with and such. That's not mom and pop. So I want to put mom and pop aside and talk about multinational corporate capitalism. The prosperity myth, that it creates prosperity. Corporations have given us wonderful things, and wonderful for them. Consider some consumer realities. The replacement of public non-profit rail transit systems with polluting, expensive automotive transit systems involving billion-dollar highway systems, millions killed or maimed over the decades who didn't have to be killed or maimed if we had fast bullet, well as LA had before General Motors bought up all the tracks, ripped them all up and made people ride buses, and then finally got rid of most of the buses and made people buy their own cars. The replacement of local organic food supplies with pesticide-ridden factory farms, antibiotic-ridden meats, shipped long distances, and there's an avalanche of disposable products, cosmetic, medical, whatever, products that keep creating solutions for things that are not problems, trying to convince you that you have this need or that problem and you should buy this and have that. The history of capitalism has been a history of both great prosperity and great poverty. We often note how wealth and poverty, we often say, isn't it how unfortunate that so much wealth here with so much poverty right here, as if it was just an unfortunate juxtaposition. And in fact, it's not at all. It's, there's a dynamic interaction between those two things. This poverty exists because of this wealth. This wealth exists because of this poverty. It's a dynamic interrelationship. The wealth of the few rests on the poverty of the many. There could not be epauchi, as Cicero called them. Epauchi, P-A-U-C-I, Latin it is, it meant the few, the really elite group that ruled the Roman Senate. The Roman senators as such were one thing, but that inner group, the richest, most powerful men run Roman Senate. They could not have ruled and lived the way they want if they didn't, unless they had slaves and proletariat, impoverished people who worked for bare subsistence. There could be no lords and ladies without serfs who labor from dawn to dusk to keep the lords and ladies in the style to which they are accustomed. There could be no corporate capitalists without workers and indentured workers and debtors and taxpayers and all sorts of other people. So there's a real relationship between wealth and poverty. I would also add that capitalism is amazingly irrational in regard to the environment. It explicitly ignores the environment, if you know what I mean. And it doesn't really ignore environmentalism. It's more than ignoring environmentalism. It condemns environmentalism. It attacks it. It has pejorative terms like tree huggers. And what are some of those other terms? Eco-terrorists, right. I mean, eco-terrorists, what are they talking about? They're the eco-terrorists. So they're irrational in regard to the environment. They treat the environment, first of all, they treat it and its resources as limitless, and that's incorrect. We now know most of our topsoil is almost gone, and the environment is not limitless. That's one. And they also treat the environment as disposable. It's a disposable environment. You can use up some stuff here and turn it all into wasteland and toss it aside and move on to somewhere else and do the same. Capitalism's crises are not exceptional. They are the common mode. In other words, under modern corporate capitalism, the irrational, the wasteful, the destructive, the impoverishing, all of that is the norm. Normal, balanced, productive, calm, equitable social relations and periods are the exception. Crises, panics, recession, crises again, that's the norm of capitalism. In the late 1780s, we had debtor rebellions in America. Shays' Rebellion, the best known one maybe, but others too. After the American Revolution, we had monetary crises. Then there was the Panic of 1792, the Panic of 1809, which lasted a number of years, the Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837. Let's skip the rest of the 19th century. You can go on to the very end of the century. That decade of 1890, where the economy, the U.S. already was the leading manufacturing country in the world, and yet that whole decade, 1890s, they couldn't pull out of the recession. they were having a tough time. Teddy Roosevelt said, "We need a war, any war, let's have a war." They were looking for a war, I mean, very explicitly. War would do two things. One, it would stimulate the economy and get it going. And two, it would distract people from their economic grievances and get them flag waving, which indeed it did with the Spanish-American War. Most of the world is capitalist, and most of the world is poor. Capitalist Nigeria, capitalist Indonesia, capitalist Mexico, capitalist Thailand, capitalist South Africa. I said to you, I said, capitalism creates immense prosperity for a few, but it creates immense poverty. And here it is. All of these capitalist countries, they're usually not even thought of as capitalist countries, isn't that right? They're just thought of as third world countries. No, they're capitalists. They're big companies that are in there, and they hire people, and they got mines and mills and whatever else. And as capitalism spreads and grows all over these worlds, so does poverty. The number of people living in poverty is growing at a faster rate than the world's population. Did you get that? So that poverty is spreading, in other words. Spreading even as wealth accumulates. You see, recessions can be a weapon, and a very useful one. Recessions are not such a bad thing for the 1% at the top. Recession is not really so bad for the big boys. It really isn't. A recession is a form of mass poverty, but it's not bad for the big boy. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many of them, you know, if it was bad. Recessions tame labor. Labor gets tamed. Labor unions get broken. Labor unions settle for miserable contracts, almost next to nothing. Recessions tame individual workers. All sorts of people line up for jobs today who would not have imagined working for those wages just 5 years ago. Small businesses are bought up at bargain prices, and even big ones. Big businesses swallow big businesses. If you study media, the media ownership patterns, they don't just buy up small independent radio stations, newspapers. I mean, you've got big businesses buying other big, huge businesses. You see, the 1% also does not want a well-educated, self-confident public. They don't want a public, potential workforce with a developed sense of entitlement. They don't want people with high levels of expectations. They want us hungry. In that sense, recessions are quite useful. The hungrier you are, the harder you will work for less and less. Why do you think Indonesians work for 17 cents an hour in Indonesia? 15, 16-year-old girls working for 17 cents in a Nike factory to make those shoes that Nike then brings over here and sells you for a real bargain for $200. Shoes that cost them $8 or $9 to make, even with all the outsourcing and all that and transportation costs. Why do you do that? Do they do that because they're so concerned about you? That's some bargain, huh? $200 for these shoes. Wow, that's so cheap. No, that's not cheap at all. That's very expensive. But why did they do it? It's to increase the margin of profit, to diminish the cost of production and keep the price high and fancy. So why is it U.S. workers don't work for 17 cents an hour? Is it because we're so much more self-respecting than the Indonesians? Is that it? Or is it something else? It's that we are at a level of historical struggle where we don't want to and don't have to and will not work for 17 cents an hour. But the goal is to get us down closer to that number from where we were. The goal is to get rid of those benefits and paid vacations, and more jobs now are just contracted. There are no benefits, nothing. The hours you work, you get paid. If you're laid off for 2 days, you're off for 2 days, and the like. Another myth is that capitalism fosters democracy, and that I'm just going to laugh away. Every democratic gain we have made, it's been with the opposition of that ruling class. The ruling landed, merchant, banking, investing class opposed the abolition of property qualifications for voting. They opposed that. They did not want it abolished. They supported property qualifications. They have always fought to limit the number of people who can participate in democracy. We see that happening right today with the so-called voter fraud things of you have to have proof that you were born here and this and that, and using these things. They've disfranchised, they figure, several million people in various states here in the U.S. They have never thought the people should be doing much with government. If you look at every elitist from ancient Greece with Socrates right on down to Roger Sherman, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, all of them saying the people should not rule, the people who own the land should rule it, and the like, very explicitly. And today, too, you see all sorts of undemocratic laws being put in, suspension of habeas corpus, mass arrests, use of torture, use of FBI for illegal use of surveillance. These are all instruments of the conservatives. Their goal, in fact, is to hamstring and limit democracy, because democracy does not serve. When democracy is successful, that creates problems for free market capitalism. I leave you with this. Someone wrote this on the internet, and I couldn't find out the party's name, but it was something like this. Actually, I'm rephrasing it. Quote, "What an incomprehensible, insane world it seemed to me until I realized that it was ruled by rapacious, money-mad sociopaths. Then it all made sense."